As we continue through the book of Hebrews, we are at the end of chapter 1 in verse 14, where the writer ends his comparison between Jesus Christ and the messengers of God, important messengers with God's words that were proclaimed to the people. And this comparison is now going on for a while in chapter 1, and it ends now. Are these angels not all ministering spirits sent out to serve for the sake of those who are to inherit salvation? So essentially, this verse says, dear readers, you have to understand that when you worship angels, or if you look very much into what angels have revealed to you, what words angels brought to you, also in the times of the Old Testament, then you have to understand that Jesus, because of what he did, his work on the cross and all those things, and because of who he is, because he is God's son, and because he's the heir, and because he's creator God, Hebrews 1 verse 10, all those things. Because of this now, you have to understand that what Jesus brought, his words, what he taught, and what the gospel is about, those are words. And those are things you need to pay a lot more attention, and even more attention. So this is very important. So he wraps up and says, the angels came with these things, and they are sent out things and beings to serve the children of God. They are essentially servants. Jesus Christ is not a servant. He's God himself. He is a serving Messiah, yes, a servant Messiah, but he's God. He's not a buddy, right? So neither are angels, but the angels are not even close to Jesus's function and rule. And so here he wraps it up in verse 14, in Hebrews 1:14, and says, "Are they not all ministering spirits?" So it almost sounds a little bit, aren't the angels compared to Jesus, aren't they essentially just servants? They're like, and I'm not downgrading angels at all right now. It's definitely not. But the author says, aren't they really just servants? And they are sent there for our sake, for those who are supposed to then get saved and inherit salvation. So this is a transition now, and now we begin to understand as we read the first couple of verses in chapter 2, why all the thing with the angels was really that important. There's an element of the Hebrews in that day, the Jews in that day, being worshipful of angels, but the reason for it was, yes, they were messengers of God, but why was this so important, and why did they then almost receive worship from the Jewish believers? Because they brought God's message. They brought good news or bad news. They brought really important revelations from God, and that's why this was so important to them. And this we now learn in chapter 2, where it says, because the angels are essentially servants, we must pay much closer attention to what we have heard, so we don't drift away from it. So what he's trying to say is, the angels, their job was to give God's words, to provide messages from God in the Old Testament, and to lead even sometimes people and that kind of thing. That was in the past. In the now, we must pay even closer attention, because now we have Jesus's words, Jesus's revelation coming to us, what he has to teach and to say to us. We must be even closer attention if we know that the angels were just the servants for our sake. Now comes the real guy, the boss, right? The Son himself comes. And now, if we know he is much more important, he's sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high, then we must pay much closer attention to what we have heard from him, so we don't drift away from it. We must pay attention to the words and the teachings of Jesus, and to what we know and learn from the Bible about Jesus, especially from the Old Testament, right? We must pay close attention so we don't drift away from it. Pay attention, pay attention, listen, and understand it. And when you understand it and listen to it and understood it, then you will be a lot less likely to drift away from this community and go back into the Jewish community. This is very important because paying attention also to what this writer is going to write will be very important to them. And he continues and says, for since the message declared by angels proved to be very reliable, and every transgression or disobedience received a just, a correct retribution, a punishment, how shall we escape if we neglect such a great salvation? So, and so what does this mean? It's a little bit enigmatic. So he says, the message that the angels brought, the angels were messengers of God's words oftentimes in the Old Testament. If if what the angels told us about God, even sometimes some laws and commandments, remember when anyone was disobedient to this thing, to these words, there was for sure punishment. It never was just, overlooked by God, hardly ever. There was always a problem. If you didn't keep in with what the angels brought to you in commandments from God, if you didn't react wisely to what the angels had to say from God, then you were in trouble. And this was a sure thing. And if that even was so sure back then, now how shall we escape? And what he means is, what do you think is going to happen to you if you now leave the faith in Jesus? Because Jesus is a whole nother ballgame compared to what the angels back then communicated. How shall we escape today? Well, if back then, whatever you were disobedient to of what the angels said from God, if that was punished for sure back then, and really bad, as you all know, you originally Jewish people here, if that was definitely a problem, well, how shall we escape if we neglect such a great salvation? So, and they know what he's talking about. He is talking about the message of Jesus. They are in danger to neglect and to drop and to go back to the Jewish thinking and to the Jewish system, in the hopes that they will find that there's going to be an alternative way to being right with God in the Jewish faith. And it is quite intriguing again to see, and we see this in other letters in the New Testament as well. I've mentioned Galatians before, for instance. It's so intriguing to see how much effort these writers of these letters put into their text to make sure that people do not mingle with the Jewish system, that they don't, in this case of the Hebrews even, that they never ever go back to this thing. And I mean, there's so many teachings out there that say, at some point Israel will be all, Jesus will then come and he will essentially then force people into believing in him. So all Israel is going to get saved and that kind of thing. I mean, I know where these quotes are from, but they're taken out of context. And if it is really true that all of Israel will be saved one day, why go through all this trouble in convincing these people so much from the Old Testament? Do not go back. It will not be good for you. So it's a great testimony to see, also by and large, that this teaching from the letter of the Hebrews to the Hebrews also speaks very strongly for or against a certain biblical view that the people of Israel have essentially a different track of salvation. So, and they are still, they're still kept by God in certain promises, or in a certain prophetic thing that will still happen to them. Whatever we read here in Hebrews, even in James, which is also written essentially to a Hebrew community, also in Galatians, in Romans, we learn a lot from this about this in Colossians too. This worldview is not realistic. The Bible and the authors of these letters, what they write does not reflect a second chance for Israel once the church is all through. It's just not realistic. It's not what he's writing here. He's doing everything that they don't go for this second option, because he doesn't see that this is a viable option. And it's very important to understand too, and it shapes our understanding of God's plan of salvation quite a bit when we read this. And so as we entered chapter 2, now the stage is set that now we go into the next few comparisons. Now we had the comparison between what angels revealed in the Old Testament. Oftentimes we see the angel of the Lord do certain things. We see the angel of the Lord speaking from the burning bush. We see the angel of the Lord also working out the Ten Commandments on Mount Sinai. So these were things the angel of the Lord, or the angels of God, revealed. And I think this is the reason why he's pushing so hard on the comparison between what angels have said back then. God has spoken many times long ago through the prophets, but now through the Son. Now, back then, angels gave revelation, and that was really punished really bad if you didn't keep what the angels said. And now, remember how bad that was, and now we have something much greater, and that's Jesus himself, the Son of God, whom the author made very big in the first few verses in chapter 1 of Hebrews. Now we have him in his words. And now think about what you would do and what would happen to you if you were to neglect the faith in him. And so that now sets the stage for the next verses in chapter 2.